guys, in this video we're going to be setting up the Google Places and Google Maps APIs and making them Turbolinks compatible using Stimulus.js. So if you aren't familiar with it, Google Maps allows you to embed maps in your website, and the Google Places Autocomplete allows you to type in a location and will give you an autocomplete dropdown of locations around the world that you can select. And in this example, they take the result of that you clicked on, and then they go move the map over to that and display a marker. So with that, we can get things like the latitude and longitude, the full address, and other things related to that location. And we can use that however we would like in our Rails app. So let's go and build this out in our application. Now, I've created a very simple Rails app with two scaffolds. We have a trip, which has just simply a name, and then we have stops. So a trip has many stops. That has an address, which is just a string, latitude and longitude, which are decimals, an arrival date, and some notes. And we want to display a map over here and use the Places autocomplete to fill out our address. So let's dive into setting all of this up. Now, first things first, we need to add the JavaScript to our page. And down here at the bottom, here's how I set up the stops table. Just for reference, the decimal columns for latitude and longitude match the precision and scale that Google Maps recommends. So that should be what you would use if you want to store latitude and longitude automatically. So we need to go and set up our script tag here for the Google Maps JavaScript. And if you don't have an API key yet, go ahead and create one on the Google Cloud admin interface and go and make sure that you have the Places and Google Maps APIs enabled for that API key so that you can use these. It will give you an error in the browser if you don't have that set up correctly or you don't pass in an API key. So the URL we need for their JavaScript is https://maps.googleapi.com/maps/api/js. And we need to pass in a key parameter. And I like to keep my credentials in rails.application.credentials. And I've called mine Google Maps API key. And then we also need to set the libraries that it loads to Places, and then we're going to have the callback parameter set to call an init map function that we need to define. That's going to have Google Maps load and then tell us when it's loaded by calling this function, which we can use to set up our code. Then we're also going to call async, defer on this, and then most importantly, we want data turbolinks eval equal to false, because we don't want this JavaScript to be loaded by turbolinks every time. This JavaScript from Google only wants to be loaded once for the page load. So we want to only evaluate it the one time. And Stimulus is going to take care of mounting our maps across our pages with turbolinks instead. So we'll talk about how we can set up that. But let's first take a look at our application. Let's reload. And let's go to our head tag and see if we have our script tag. And we want to make sure that our key here displays our key. So we need to go into our credentials and fill out that Google Maps API key for it to render out. So you can run Rails credentials edit -- environment equals development if you're on Rails 6. If you're on Rails 5.2, you can't use the -- environment and you just have one Rails credentials file, and that's okay. You can put it in there. And you can put this in an environment variable or secrets if you want on an older version of Rails. So you should see here the key now. I just have an example key, ABCDEF, and it's printing out correctly after restarting my Rails server. So that is good, and once that key is an actual real key, not my example here, then you'll be able to load the JavaScript. The other thing we need to run in our terminal is Rails Webpacker install Stimulus to make sure that Stimulus is enabled in the Webpacker pipeline. We are going to go and grab this hello controller, and we're going to rename it to Places controller. And we will use this to define our JavaScript for the Google Places API. So we can get rid of the targets and the connect setup right here. And we need to basically connect this to our form. So let's go ahead and console log places, and we'll go into our form for our stops, and we'll add data, controller, places here. And if we refresh our page, we should see that this loads correctly. So we get the word places printed out here, and we also get this init map is not a function error. This is because that init map callback that we defined on the Google Maps JavaScript include tag is looking for a global method called init map. So we'll say window.init map equals function ..args. We'll collect all of the arguments, and what we want this function to do is to trigger a custom event so that our JavaScript can be loaded correctly whenever Google Maps is finally loaded. So Stimulus is going to connect very quickly before Google Maps is even loaded, and so we don't want to delay any of that stuff here, and so that's why we are going to define our init custom event instead. So let's go into this init map method and say const event equals document.create event. We'll just give it a name of, say, events. We're going to have event init event, and the ID for this will be Google Maps callback, and we'll pass in true and true for the other two arguments. Event.args equals args, and window dispatch event. So this is going to create a custom event for us to broadcast out to all of the Stimulus controllers that need Google Maps. So we can use this across all of our different controllers that you use Google Maps, and they can listen to that. So to listen to it, our action on our form stops form html.erb will need to be defined here. So what we'll say is Google Maps callback at window will call the places.init map function. So now we can define an init map function here, and this should now have access to the Google variable. So if we run this, what we will see is the Google variable printed out here whenever that gets called. So we need to double check as well and make sure that this is formatted correctly. We need to use the hash symbol there for init map. I always get that wrong. And you can see Google Maps is printed out, or the Google object in JavaScript is now printed out. And what will be not working about this is if you navigate around and come back to the form, you don't get this printed out a second time, because the second time that Stimulus connects to this form, the Google Maps event is not going to be fired. It will only be fired the very first time on page load. So to do that, we can make this say if type of Google is not equal to undefined, we can manually call this .init map. So basically, if Google Maps is loaded, we can initialize this Stimulus controller immediately. So we're kind of building our own initialize method here and calling it when it's necessary accordingly. So from there, we can actually go and build out our Google Maps and our Google Autocomplete for the Places API. So what we'll need is a data target here for places.field. And this is going to allow us to reference the field inside of our Stimulus controller, and we can initialize the Google Places JavaScript here. So to do that, we can say this.autocomplete equals new Google Maps Places autocomplete, and we can give it this.field target. That will grab the DOM element for us and set that up. Then we can say, if we would like, we can connect this to a map as well. So maybe we'll go down to our form onto the sidebar, and we'll say div data target equals places.map, and we'll set style equal height is, say, 400 pixels tall. Otherwise, we won't be able to see the map. and we'll say this.map equals new Google Maps map. And then it will mount to this.map target and pass in some options. The center for our map should be something like a Google Maps lat long, and something maybe like the center of the US, which is 98.35 longitude and 39.5 latitude. Then we can also set our zoom to say like 4, so it's fairly zoomed out. Then our autocomplete can actually be connected to this. Autocomplete bind to bounds this.map, which is kind of cool. Then we can say this.autocomplete set fields, address, components, geometry, icon, name, and you can customize these to be whatever fields you need the autocomplete to return you. So from here, we need to say this.autocomplete add listener on place changed. So whenever the user selects a place, we want to call some callback. So we'll say this.place changed, bind this, and we'll define our own method here called place changed. And this will be called whenever that is done. So the last piece is that we probably want to create a marker so that we can display that item on the map. So we'll create a Google Maps marker, and we'll set some options here. So we want our map to be this.map. An anchor point will be new Google Maps point, and we'll just set the default here to say 0, -29. That doesn't really matter because when we receive a place, we will have that updated to display accordingly. So for this, we need to do a few things. We need to say let place equals this autocomplete get place. That will return the place that the user has selected. If there is no place geometry, we want to basically return. You can do something like a window.alert, say no details available for input, and you could print out this message if you wanted. And actually, we can use the nice interpolation with backticks here. So we'll say place.name for that. And that's just kind of a guard to make sure that the user selected a place with an actual location. So if place.geometry.viewport, then we can say this.map.fit bounds to place.geometry.viewport. That's going to move the map to wherever best it zooms in on that location. Otherwise, we're just going to set the map set center to place.geometry.location, and this.map.set zoom to a default zoom size of 17. So if there is no like actual good information on where to focus in, for example, if you type the United States, it needs to be zoomed out pretty far. But if you type like a very specific address, you need to be zoomed in a lot more. So the viewport will take care of that automatically for you as long as it's returned. And if it's not, we just have some fallbacks that we can use instead. So then we can set our marker to a position, which is the place geometry.location. And then we can set the marker to be visible. So set visible is true. And this.latitude target.value, we could set to the place geometry.location.latitude, and the longitude target can be the longitude. So for us, we have two visible fields here, and we can just wire those up. So we can say target equals places.latitude, and the other one will be longitude. So we can paste that in here and change this to longitude, and we'll add those fields up here. So we have our map, latitude, and our longitude. So those are the 4 targets that we're referencing in our JavaScript. That's just going to make it so that when we choose a place, we will automatically set those values in the form, and then we'll also set that information visible with our marker. So that should be good, and we can try all this out in our browser and see if we made any mistakes or typos or anything like that. So what we've got here is we got a typo on new.Google Maps. So we want new space Google Maps. And you'll see we now get a placeholder for enter a location. We can type in something like Chicago, Illinois. Our JavaScript will trigger, and we get an error saying there were no details available for input. So that is what you will get whenever there is an issue and there's no data returned. We typed components wrong here in our set field, so it didn't actually return that information. And the other improvement that I want to make here is if we change this from a text field to a search field, we won't get any autocompletes for address, like a billing address, with LastPass and other tools like that. So now if we type Chicago, Illinois, we can select this and our latitude and longitude is set. So all of that is working, but our map over here on the right side doesn't appear to be visible. So let's go over to our display flex, take a look at our map, and it looks like we just need to set a width on this maybe, because our height is visible. So let's try width of maybe 400 pixels, and it is visible. So maybe we can do like a 100%, and it just needs to be like a display block, maybe? Nope, it is still invisible. So if we were to set this to a specific width, it is displaying, and that's okay with me. So we can worry about displaying this or fixing those display issues later on, but this is pretty good. So let's also add class of padding of, say, 4 on that. And there we go. So now we get our location. We're zoomed into basically the central United States by default. Then we can type in, say, Chicago, and we'll see that we're moved to Chicago, and a marker is placed right at that location. So if we said Sydney, Australia, that's actually going to submit our form, which we do not want when we hit enter there. So we're going to also add an event for this. So basically, we want to handle the action of this address field being submitted. So when we hit enter in this field, we want to cancel that so that it doesn't submit the form. So if we were to say an action on here, we can do on key down event. We'll go to the places, key down event, or method. We'll say key down. And we need to have the event passed in for this. If event.key equals enter, we can say event.prevent default. So now let's try this one more time. We'll go to Sydney, Australia. We will try and edit, and we'll say, let's go to Sydney Airport instead. And if you were to type a half word in and hit enter, you're going to get the error message rather than the form being submitted and saving that incorrect result. So that is now working like we would expect it to. However, when we edit a stop like this, if we refresh the page, we don't actually zoom in on the correct location. This should be zooming in on Sydney Airport, and it is not. So let's go ahead and update our form to include that information as a data attribute up here. So we want to call this places latitude, and this will be stop.latitude, and places longitude will be stop.longitude, and those will be our 2 values that we can pass in for our location. So we can also go into our JavaScript and update our initialize. so that we will use these two default values for our center if there is no latitude and longitude. So the way to do that is we can say this.data.get latitude, or we'll use 39.5, and this.data.get longitude, or we can use negative 98.35. So that's going to basically check and see if we have the correct latitude and longitude from our existing location. So if we refresh our page now, we are correctly looking at Australia. However, our zoom is not correct. So we could do a ternary here if we wanted and say this.data.get latitude equals null. Then we could use 4 as our default, or we could zoom in like a 17 as our default if we actually have a location. So if it's null, we won't. If it is an existing thing, we will zoom in to level 17. And this, you could do more if you wanted to. You could hit their API and figure out what the best viewport or zoom level is for that and use that instead. But for now, a default of like 17, maybe 15 or something will work best. So that's just going to zoom us into wherever we are located at when we provide a stop. So if we were to go to stops new, we shouldn't get any errors, and we should be zoomed on in the middle of the United States with no JavaScript errors. So let's go navigate around with Turbolinks. Let's put Chicago, Illinois in. Let's create our stop. Let's go back. Let's go edit. And all of this is working now with no errors because we have our initialize working the first time with Google Maps. Then the rest of that, it's already loaded, and our stimulus controller just needs to simply call the initialize itself. And that's all there is to it. If you want to go and use maps in other ways in your application, you can just set up your connect and event or init map events like we have here. Just put those in your other controllers, and then just make sure that you have this initial action at the beginning so that the very first page load, it will initialize your maps for your stimulus controllers. And that is all there is to it. It's a little bit tricky to wrap your head around probably at first if you aren't familiar with Stimulus, but this is definitely something that makes working with Turbolinks and Google Maps really, really easy. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.